That's why I got involved in sort of campaigning in the first place. I was explaining to someone back in 2007, 2008, that I'd come off transition pretty lightly because I'd only lost the relationship with my dad and I'd only lost my job. And
Wow.
I knew people who'd come up, suffered much worse than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I came away from that conversation, it suddenly dawned on me, either one of those is a huge thing for anyone to deal with.
Absolutely.
And yet I'm saying this is a low-cost transition.
Mm.
Why are we expecting trans people to go through those kind of things? Why are we expecting people to pay such an enormous price just to be themselves?
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. Come with us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I identify as a cisgender woman, and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I have a conversation with Helen Belcher, an activist working to promote trans inclusion for more than a decade. Helen's pronouns are she and her, and she is a woman with a trans history. Find out what that means to Helen in this episode. We also talk about the different phases of conversion therapy, losing your religion, being publicly trans in politics, systemic transphobia and holding the media accountable, how the bathroom argument is really about gender apartheid, voting for what we want rather than against what we don't want, and how knowing the direction is more important than knowing the destination on the journey towards being more of yourself. It was recorded on the 25th of May 2021. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hello, I'm Helen Belcher.
Welcome, Helen, and tell me about your gender experience.
That's a very, very open question.
It is.
And I guess what most people mean by that is some level of transition story. But I think there's also an ongoing element to how you perceive gender. So which one would you like? Or would you like elements of both?
Both, please.
Both.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, the transition story goes back quite a while now, the best part of 20 years.
Mm.
And I guess I was brought up as a boy and always found that I wasn't quite like other boys. I didn't play the same way. I didn't really understand where they were coming from. I ended up just socializing with girls rather than boys until I was about 9. And then suddenly it wasn't cool for girls to have what they perceived as a boy hanging around.
Mm.
And then I sort of ended up being quite lonely, really. I stumbled across 2 other outcasts and became friends with them. One turned out to be gay, and the other, I think, ended up as addicted to various substances. But I lost touch with the second one a long, long time ago. Went to an all-boys boarding school, hated it, because, again, I didn't fit in. I was into music and academics, and they were all into sports and looking good, muscles and things. And it was just like, no, this is not what I want, not what I am.
Mm-hmm.
And then fell into evangelical Christianity at about the same time as puberty hit. And you just kind of confronted continually with the evils of the world, and homosexuality was one of those evils.
Mm.
And then towards the end of school days, a good friend of mine who'd led the Christian Union the year before me and had left school to go on to university confided in me that he was gay.
Mm-hmm.
And I grilled him because it's like, well, what does that mean? What's it like? And I kind of worked out, well, I wasn't gay.
Because you were wondering about your own identity and what was going on for you at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just, clung on to evangelical Christianity in a kind of rock of trying to find myself, really.
Mm.
And then after I got married when I was 30, had 2 young kids, and like looking back, I'd gone through 2 breakdowns of varying degrees in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just mentally collapsed towards the end of my 30s. I
Wow.
just could not keep it going anymore. Started browsing websites about healing because I didn't want this to carry on, and stumbled across a set of stories which increasingly I thought, actually, yes, that I relate to those,
Mm-hmm.
where people had accepted being trans within that Christian framework.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started looking at the healing sites and realized they weren't healing at all. It was all about denial.
Yeah.
Um,
Was that
um,
conversion therapy? Was that
yes,
kind
I
of
mean,
what that
that's
was
what we would
about?
call it now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, there was one which I sort of remember where the individual was talking about, well, every time they thought about, looked at someone on the street and thought, oh, I'd like to wear that, or I'd like to look like that, they would
Mm-hmm.
sort of make a sign of the cross and cross the road. And I just thought, I don't want to be some kind of, you know,
Mm.
gender vampire, as it were.
Wow.
Sort of having to avoid the sign, make the sign of the cross to avoid, treat women as pieces of
Yeah.
garlic or something. It was weird.
Yeah.
But the sort of resonance of people who'd sort of found a way to maintain faith and be trans
Mm-hmm.
uh, was interesting, and it started to open my eyes a lot more about things like inerrancy of the Bible and so on. Started questioning what I'd actually been taught since I
Mm-hmm.
was a small person.
Yeah.
And the complication, of course, was that I had a wife and 2 small children.
Mm-hmm.
So what was I going to do about, what were we going to do? What was I going to do? What were we going to do? And clearly sort of still very strongly embedded within that evangelical framework. And this is the conversion therapy story, I guess, eventually sort of, my wife and I had a few conversations and she just couldn't come to grips with it. And then one
Mm-hmm.
Christmas, it all came to a head. And that's when my sort of breakdown started.
Mm-hmm.
And she realized immediately it was bigger than the 2 of us. And so went to our church leader for help for the 2 of us. And while it started, those conversations started along the lines of, well, we're going to help you be the best you can be. It became clear very quickly that the best me that I could be did not include expressing any level of femininity.
Mm. Yeah.
My wife and I were leaders of a small group. The church was sort of made up of several cells of people, and so we were one of the cell group leaders, feeding directly into the leadership in the church. So we were seen as leaders in the church.
Mm-hmm.
So we stepped back from that. And then one of the church leaders came round one day and said that I couldn't even think of going to church as Helen.
Mm.
And then when I said something, he sat in my armchair and said, yeah, you really ought to do something about that anger problem.
Wow.
It's like,
Mm.
and, all the talk about conversion therapy now, I find it quite hard to sort of say, well, I didn't go through a lot of the kind of praying out demons and all of this kind of stuff. But actually I did to some extent. And I was in an environment which was very much restricting expression, which wasn't strictly cisgender and heteronormative.
So
And
there's subtleties within things like conversion therapy, things that you might not even recognize as that, but anything that is not accepting of who you are, and like being the best you can be, anything that says not like that,
yeah,
is kind of like conversion therapy, isn't it?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's,
Yeah.
and it's not that affirmative means that you should be going, oh, yes, go for this, go for that. But affirmative is much more in terms of sitting back and letting the individual talk through and work out what's right for them.
Mm.
And it's not that transition, different gender expression is right for some people, because it's about what they feel comfortable and happy being.
Mm-hmm.
Being trans is not a walk in the park.
Mm.
So, I mean, that sort of whole questioning aspect, sort of, I eventually lost faith because I couldn't sustain it. We ended up having problems pretty much every church we tried to go to.
Wow.
My wife stuck with it for longer than I did. And we both ended up really losing faith and moving on from that. But that's terrifying at the time because your whole social life is built around being a member of this tightly knit group who are trying to make the group bigger, sort of evangelical proselytizing. And suddenly you find yourself outside that, and all your friends are still inside it. And they're all then having problems because the leaders are saying one thing and you're saying something else, and their natural tendency is to follow the leaders. And that's also part of the whole conversion therapy thing, because it's not just, the praying out of demons or whatever. It's the creation of an environment which doesn't allow or which enforces a level of conformity. Whether that, and it's generally not thought through conformity either. It's conformity because a leader or a revered book or something says something, and that's how it must be, and people just apply it.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, the other angle of it was my own family. We tried to work through within the four of us that we recognised that there was a journey for everybody to go on. As the children were growing up, we tried to make sure that if they were facing problems, they were our problems, not just their problems to deal with. My wife stayed with me. That was far from clear that was going to happen for either of us at the beginning.
Yeah.
So we had our silver wedding anniversary 2 years ago, almost to the day. 27 years married this week.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, we always say marriages, birthdays just happen, but you have to work at marriages.
Yeah.
I probably could work a lot harder at mine. And our two kids are grown up now and extremely well adjusted to the world around. But the sort of wider family, I mean, my family are all kind of going, we've known you're trans since you were 5. It was just a question of when you were going to do something about it.
Wow.
And that was not what I'd expected at all, because I thought I'd been very careful at hiding it all. And my dad, basically, though, he said, I kind of knew that was the case, but you've now got young children and you've made your bed. That's your lot in life now. Deal with it. And so he couldn't cope with me transitioning at all. And so I didn't speak to him for the last 14 years of his life. He died a couple of years ago. And so that was tough. But ultimately, all he ended up doing was isolating himself from the rest of the family who, were having me around. And I thought that was very sad because my mum had died, a couple of years before we got married. Joanna and I got married. So my kids really grew up without knowing either of my parents in any way. And actually, what was even more sad was when my son passed his driving test and we said, right, you need to go and drive somewhere on your own. He kind of went, where to? And so he said, well, how about Granddad? And he just looked at us and said, why would I go there?
Yeah.
And there just was no relationship between him and either of his grandchildren. And that was very sad to see as well. You grow up thinking your family is the most well-adjusted environment that there is. It's crises hit and you suddenly realise how dysfunctional it really is.
That is an interesting one, yes. I've been realising a lot of that myself,
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just one of those things. They are who they are and they can't help it because they've all had that example set for them. It's very hard to break out of, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, assuming my children have children of their own, it'd be interesting to see what happens there. So, yes, that there was quite a journey. I lost my job.
Wow.
Because the two directors that I worked for directly couldn't comprehend the idea that I might not actually be who I appeared to be to them. But, of course, that was illegal, so they paid me quite a bit of money to go away. So set up a company in direct competition with them. And and attracted some of their leading lights, which was quite interesting. And we started winning business off them, which was very sweet. And then they sold that company themselves for a year after about a year and a half. So the sweetness disappeared a bit. And the total irony was, again, a couple of years ago, 2019 was quite a big year for me in a number of different ways. A couple of years ago, I sold that company. I sold it actually back to the two directors.
Wow.
So that not only did they pay me to go away, but they paid me an awful lot more money to buy what I'd done with it. So
that sounds so satisfying.
It was. Well, I was speaking to the person who was my lead programmer shortly afterwards, and she just said, "Wow, you must teach me your Zen techniques, oh Jedi Master."
Excellent.
It was, yeah. And I guess, I've sort of stumbled into activism. When I transitioned, the whole Gender Recognition Act debate was going through. We used to call it the GER Bill at the time, 2003, 2004. And so I, wrote to my MP at the time and said, you can't, you've got to sort of allow existing marriages to continue, because obviously that was what was going to affect me going down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the first real bit of political campaigning that I'd ever done back in 2004.
Mm-hmm. And
then ended up 2008 getting involved in support groups and working with one of the charities in the sector. 2009 helped setting up Transmedia Watch, because I sort of recognised that you can have all the legal changes you want, but if you haven't got societal change within the media, then it's going to be really hard to make anything stick. And have been campaigning increasingly to the point where I'm now an elected councillor at a unitary authority, and have stood for Parliament twice. That's sort of now how I fill my time. So doing a lot of that. And obviously over the last few years, that's been increasingly tricky and somewhat depressing to see the whole environment go back. And whilst, to go back, Esther, to what you're wanting to do, which is sort of a discussion about gender, what that started to do is I sort of realised last year that what the anti-campaign was doing was not necessarily stripping me of my gender, but stripping me of feeling human. And I think that wasn't very nice, because you were sort of, not only were we going through the pandemic, and so being quite restricted in terms of going out and meeting people, but having your very basic humanity dismissed as well. And so fighting just to be recognised as a person who had the right to participate in public life the same as anybody else. So, and I sort of realised that I'd spent an awful lot of time being professionally trans, as it were, which is something I never wanted to be, and how that sort of starts to strip away some of your sense of self and sense of how you fit into the world, because you suddenly get put in a box. You're the professional campaigner, you're the expert in this, talk to me about this. And actually, I'm a person, I'd quite like to get on and do some gardening. Quite like to go and drive around, see the wonderful countryside we have around us, but no, you're constantly boxed and asked to defend this particular outrage or that particular statement, which has all been misquoted out of context.
Yeah, it must be an exhausting position to be in, to be fair. Yeah, it is.
I sort of driven on, we did achieve an awful lot in the early part of the last decade, but it didn't cement itself into the structures. And I think what we've got is a level of structural transphobia, whereas society is not at the same place. And it's a conversation I had at the beginning of the month on polling day with somebody. Trans had knocked on about 800 doors throughout the campaign when we were allowed to campaign, which is a fair number of doors to knock on in 7 weeks.
Yeah.
And being trans had just not come up at all. One candidate had stood against me on an anti-trans platform, which itself is a pretty disgusting position, because what she was saying was that this person should not be elected simply because she is trans.
Wow.
And that's a vile position, actually.
It is.
But chatting to one guy, and he said, no, your personal history is well known throughout the town, and we all think that if you're brave enough to not only go through that but be public about it, then you're going to be brave to fight for our town, and that's what we want.
Wow, that's great. Yeah.
So, and that was the only time it came up on the doorsteps, and it was incredibly affirmative.
I would definitely use that in your promotional material. Use it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm reluctant to push myself as the trans candidate. I mean, in both 2017 and 2019, I stood for Chippenham, which was a Lib Dem target seat. So, as the Lib Dem candidate. So, suddenly a lot of people are very interested in you. And what I found about public life is suddenly you get a position and all sorts of people are really wanting to talk to you and, and hear your opinions. Well, my opinions haven't changed that much over 40 or 50 years. And so suddenly you end up in a position and people are falling over themselves, which I find quite strange. I guess what I've done is become slightly better at expressing them, although listeners might disagree with that. But there was an awful lot of attention in both those general election campaigns about you might be the first trans MP. Well, I might have been. But going after the trans vote is not going to win me any election. It happens to be who I am.
Yeah.
But I wanted to be the MP for Chippenham. I wanted to represent those constituents. I wanted to fight on all sorts of things in Parliament. So better education, electoral reform. I wanted to stay in the EU. The whole equalities aspect, making lives better for everybody, not just trans people. All of those are key things to what I was campaigning on. So to try and box me in as the trans MP or the trans protective MP is again quite minimising.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you feel needs to happen to make things better for everyone, including gender diverse people? I know that's a big question, right?
How long have you got?
How long have you got?
How long have you got? There's a whole bunch of structural issues. We have a media which is owned by very few people and is accountable to very few people. And so you have large parts of the press who basically can print what they want without any comeback at all. I mean, I saw a statistic yesterday that the Times this year, in the 144 days that there had been in 2021, the Times and Sunday Times have printed 224 pieces about trans people or trans issues, not one of which has been penned by a trans person, pretty much all of which will be condemning trans people, telling us to get back in our box.
Wow.
Yeah. So where's the balance and responsibility in that? So unless we fundamentally change the way the media is accountable, I think at the moment it's going to be very difficult to change that narrative. The other aspect, I think, is I think we need to be smarter at countering some of the arguments that are being put forward about how trans people, trans women in particular, are seen as dangerous or perverted or violent. I don't accept that. I don't think there's the evidence to show that trans women are in any way a systemic problem. We have criminals who are trans in the same way that there are loads of criminals who are not trans. But the fact that a small number of people who are trans are also criminals doesn't mean that every trans person, therefore, is potentially criminal. And that is the association that's being made.
Yeah.
But even if you accepted this horrific argument, then what are the solutions which are being proposed,
Right.
essentially?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're saying that, well, trans women should be banned from women's spaces, where do trans women go? And there are two options, essentially, where trans women should go into men's spaces. Well, I don't know any trans women who would do that. Why would we put ourselves at risk of danger?
Totally.
Or trans women should have or trans people, not just trans women, trans people should have separate spaces. So you demand that public authorities, who are going to be incredibly cash strapped following the pandemic, suddenly have to spend millions and millions of pounds building for specific facilities for a few tens of thousands of people. That's not going to happen.
Mm.
So, but the argument essentially boils down, or their solutions essentially boil down to either segregation, some kind of gender apartheid, or elimination. Trans people simply should not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the net effect of all of their campaigns resulting in one of those two results.
Mm-hmm.
The Bell versus Tavistock case back at the end of 2020, where as a result of that, the NHS significantly changed access to puberty blockers for trans youth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's predicated on an idea that if we can stop trans youth transitioning, then we'll stop trans people altogether. Well, you won't. All you'll do is cause more cost, more upset, more distress, which will cost more to sort out. Trans people have never stopped existing.
That's right.
So, but the whole argument there is based on we need to stop this trans menace. We need to eradicate it. And so I think we need to start calling it out as for what it is. This is a hateful campaign which aims to eliminate difference or shove it to one side in a box where we can conveniently ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And neither of those have any place in a modern society.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what all of these little organizations are pushing for. They're pushing for apartheid, gender apartheid, or they're pushing for trans people to be eliminated. And we need to call it out.
Totally.
My feeling is that people as a whole, they don't understand that. They understand that there's some noise around trans people. They're being fed leading questions about alarm. But despite that, still, I think the vast majority of people still will accept trans people for who we say we are.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's the one bright light. This media campaign appears to be limited in its impact in society. But where it has started, I think, to have an impact is in government bodies. So things like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, in the courts. So that's where the problem now is. And we're back to fighting that systemic transphobia. Back in 2015, when I gave evidence to a parliamentary inquiry, I preferred systemic sexism. There was kind of innate apathy or inertia within government systems to changing anything to accommodate trans people. That's not transphobia. That's just laziness, apathy. But I think now we've moved to a point where when you've got the head of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission saying, but people have a right to question trans people's existence in certain spaces, well, that's the head of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission saying people have a right to say trans people should be eliminated or shoved into a box where we don't have to think about them. Now, that's not actually a sensible position for an equalities body to take, but that's where we are now.
Wow. Yeah. So what would be a solution? What do you think needs to happen? Probably stop maybe talking about the whole bathroom debate and focus on what?
Yeah, focus on how trans people actually live their lives. I mean, it hit my wife because she was saying it can't be, last year she was saying it can't be, when all the kind of bathroom stuff was going on, she said it can't be as bad as you say. And I said, right, well, imagine I go into London because I do some work in Parliament. I go into London and I get arrested for using the women's toilets in Parliament because it's a public building. How would you feel if every time I went into London, you weren't sure that I would be coming back?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it means. So it's a question of allowing trans people to live our lives. We currently police spaces on behaviour. Where is the case to change that and police on appearance, essentially, is what they're going to try and propose, or what they're trying to propose.
Mm.
And actually how that impacts on other aspects, other groups of people. Butch lesbians are already reporting increasing aggression against them in women's spaces. You shouldn't
Mm.
be here. You don't look like a woman.
Yeah.
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 Now,
Mm.
what kind of society is that?
Mm.
So that's what we need to sort of push back against. The system has worked well, and it's now in danger of breaking down because of some fears.
Mm.
So it's a question of talking to people in authority, people who can make decisions that do affect people's lives, and pointing out this is what the alternative being proposed results in. We've got this situation now, which has existed for decades, and you weren't worried about it because nothing happened. But now
Yeah.
you're hearing about all these fears, and people are proposing changes which are actually unworkable, would cost women a lot because it's women that are being protected in inverted quotes.
Mm.
But is that a society that you really would want to live in? I mean, the parallel, I guess, is the government's proposal to introduce requirement to show photo ID when you vote.
Mm.
Yeah, now that's a sort of a similar kind of campaign. Oh, but people could vote fraudulently. They don't. There was one case in 2019. But people think, oh yeah, well actually, no, I can understand a case for sort of increasing security there. Until you point out what the impact on them is likely to be, because it's not so much do you have ID or not, but it's what happens if you get to the polling station and the official at the polling station decides you don't look like the photo on your photo ID, so bars you from voting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Mm.
that's likely to happen. It's much more
Mm-hmm.
likely to happen than voter fraud.
Yes.
So, and it's that we've kind of fallen in our society into a very weird place where we're not really sure what's true anymore, and when we don't have a media which is capable of explaining the impact of some of it, it's all
Mm-hmm.
working on the sensation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about working out how we engage and how we start putting forward the impact of these decisions. It's all very well to understand a campaign and listen to the fears, but what are the impacts of those policy changes? And I guess people just need to, sadly, because I think we've had 20, 30 years of society becoming increasingly disengaged from politics and the news because it's just all too terrible and exhausting
Mm.
to deal with.
Mm.
But I think we need to try and get people more engaged with politics and the news
Totally.
to
Yeah.
start questioning what it is they are being told.
Yeah. I mean, politics is it's such a minefield because for me, I feel like I have not found a way to do politics in a way that allows me to keep my sanity intact.
Yes.
So I'm like, I just can't even, and like just digging into it even a little bit, I can't even. But I mean, my way of doing politics is doing this podcast, for example. So that's
Yeah.
my way of contributing, but in a positive way. But it's like sifting through all the nonsense really and actually get to the core of what's important.
Yeah. And it's hard. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, many years ago when I was in the Christian world, I was trained to do some news reporting. and sort of learning that effectively you could, if you shove a microphone in front of somebody's face, you can almost get them to say what you want them to say. So I've kind of had 30 years of knowledge of understanding how a media narrative can be created. And yet it's the easiest thing in the world to sort of kick back and watch bits of the news and think, oh, that's happening, and not want to kind of unpick that, or because it's intellectually harder to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's from somebody who's had training and done media things for the last 10 years.
Mm.
And it's still hard for me to do that. So
Yeah.
I get it completely.
Mm-hmm.
And when all you see of politics is politicians shouting at each other across the House of Commons, or just deliberately taking counter positions in a television debate, well, why would you want to get involved in that? Of course it's a switch off.
Yeah. See, that's exactly it. Because I feel like I see politics kind of like, it's kind of like this tennis match, but like a tennis match of hate mostly. And I feel like I don't want to take part in it. I don't even want to be in the crowd watching it. So I feel like I'm taking a step back. I don't watch the news. I don't read the paper. I feel like if there's something I need to know, I will come across it. Someone will tell me about it. But also, it's like, yeah, like when you take that bird's eye view on it and see it for what it is, how do you get involved in a way that is, going to make a positive difference? Like you have to really sift through a lot of BS to get to the core of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't intend to get involved in politics at all. Back in 2012, as part of Transmedia Watch, I gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry into press standards and ethics, which was quite an event, sitting in the blue chair, which former prime ministers and newspaper editors and so forth had sat in. And from that point, I had about a year where every few days somebody would say, you should stand as an MP. You should stand as an MP, including at one point a baroness who was talking to me in the tea room in the House of Lords, which was one of the most surreal conversations I've ever had. And I ended up really thinking about it and deciding by the end of 2012 that I didn't want to be an MP because I didn't want to have an opinion on everything.
Right.
And then in 2015, I snapped and joined the Liberal Democrats and seemed to suddenly, I don't know, I knew a handful of MPs and so on. And so I had my arm twisted to go through the parliamentary candidate approval process, stand in elections for local council. And suddenly, when I put my papers in to be selected as for Chippenham, I said to my wife, don't worry, I won't get selected because it's a target seat. I'm a newly approved candidate. Nobody knows who I am. There's no danger of this happening at all. And my top tip for aspiring parliamentary candidates is to make sure you're the only candidate in a seat, because that's what happened to me in 2016. And suddenly I found myself as a parliamentary candidate who'd never fought a parliamentary election before, being there in a target seat. And I'm just, I didn't set out to do any of this. I wanted to make a difference, but I didn't set out to be anyone or have a particular role. I didn't know I didn't know how it was going to work, but, I had no aspirations of being an MP at all.
Yeah, so it kind of just showed up for you that way because you were kind of being in your lane, doing your own thing, and then I guess politics showed up in your lane, right?
Yeah, and actually in 2015, 2016, 2017, it actually harmed some of the campaigning that I was doing on trans issues because suddenly in 2015, 2016, after it became known I joined the Lib Dems, the only politicians who would speak to me were Lib Dems. And there weren't that many of them in Parliament. 2017, Labour started talking to me again. But yeah, so it's been harmful from the perspective of doing the trans campaigning. But then, as I say, there's many other things I think which are systemically wrong with our country. We have a voting system which just doesn't work anymore. having won an election now, and I'm still saying actually the voting system doesn't work, because for some people you're trying to persuade them to vote against what they don't want rather than actually for what they want. And we have an entire election campaign where millions of people now are trying to work out how they vote against what they don't want, which is a complete inversion of how politics should be. So it's all of those systemic things that we've got to sort out in our society, and that's one of the things I wanted to try and do. And I still don't know whether politics is the right way to do it, but I don't think I've got any immediate career coming at all, so politics might be all I have.
So what can we do as people who are just maybe, I guess we're all trying to do the right thing, for ourselves and people we love and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think it's calling stuff out when you see it. Being brave to do that. Because if you're not brave, then the person who's the subject of it has to be braver. And I think it's very easy to sort of walk on past and think that's not my problem. Whereas, in fact, if this anti-trans campaign does get its way, then it will affect every woman and girl in the land. So that's something I think to fight for. So it's about getting connected, getting involved, not being afraid to call hateful stuff out. And that can happen wherever you are, at work, at home, getting involved in if you see something in the media, complaining about that, if that's, completely wrong. Supporting some of the organisations which are really under attack at the moment. Declaration of interest. I lead a small group called Transactual, trying to do a lot of constructive stuff behind the scenes at the moment. But I mean, this weekend you've had loads of attacks all on Stonewall, for example. Mermaids as an organisation is continually under attack. Gendered intelligence is under attack a lot. An awful lot of trans groups are just in survival, firefighting mode, because most of them are support groups. Most trans groups are sort of, half a dozen people who meet in their nearest town to sort of G each other up and shore each other up. And it's those groups that need support. How can you help youth? Don't go at it at the idea that they, some youth do have a very clear idea of who they are, but a lot don't. But your position is not to tell them who they are or not, but is to help them down the path of self-discovery. So it's basically a plea just to get involved in whatever way you feel comfortable with. Doing the high-profile stuff is not comfortable for a lot of people.
I know it's not for me, and I just know that's not my lane, Yeah.
So, but there will be other things that you can do. Even if it's as simple as setting up a standing order and giving £5 a month to one of the LGBT charities to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What are you reading or listening to? Are you are you pushing forwards trans and gender non-conforming writers and artists? Are you listening to them? Are you saying to your friends, I heard something really interesting, and this opened my eyes because. So that it's lots of, the ground level stuff. In a political campaign, you have what's called the air war, which is the politicians going on the media and shouting at each other, and the ground war, which is people going around and talking to each other on doorsteps or in parks or cafes or whatever. And you need both. And at the moment, we're doing very badly in the air war because people are keeping our planes on the ground. But we can do the ground war, and that can be equally effective. Because if you get the parachutists coming in, and you've got a good ground operation, you can, looking at World War II analogies, really poor World War II analogy. But, the parachutist lands. If you've got a home guard, they're not going to get very far. The parachutists aren't going to get very far. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
that's where I think we need to sort of work on, is much more community level activity.
Yeah, building connections.
Mm.
I think sometimes we also have to consider like our own energy. We only have enough time and energy to do specific things. So it's important to focus them on the right stuff and to really be discerning about it. And I think a lot of the fighting against can just be really draining. And I'm not saying it's pointless, but I think maybe energy is better focused on, like, maybe what you said, like not voting against what you don't want, but figuring out what you really do want and working towards that and for that and campaigning for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of take the voting bit out, but yes, I mean, I think
Mm.
I really like the analogy of spoons, which is used when people
Yes.
who've got ME or CFS.
I use it myself as an introvert and highly sensitive person. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It's
and
great.
you only have so many spoons to get through the day.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do with your spoons?
Mm.
I think the flip side to that is that it then means, oh gosh, well, I better use that spoon wisely, and that can paralyze people as well.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think it's just a case of trying things out and then seeing what works. I mean,
Yeah.
going back to the whole gender transition story, I never set out on a transition. I was taking one step at a time, thinking I'd get to a point where I could just stop. I wouldn't need to go through taking hormones or having surgeries or anything like this.
Mm-hmm.
I would get to a point where I could cope by expressing myself in a particular way for a specific amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
That would assuage all the feelings. And yet, every step I took, I hadn't reached the point where it was enough. It made me feel whole.
Mm.
And I think you don't have to have a clearly defined destination
Mm-hmm.
in order to start on the journey, but you need to know the direction you want to go in.
Mm-hmm.
You might not know where you're going to end up as a result, but you need to know which way you want to go.
Mm.
So, yeah, I think as a society, we put a lot of emphasis on failure and how disastrous it is. And I'm not convinced that that's a particularly helpful way of looking at things.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a good way to keep people from doing stuff that matters to them because they're so worried they're going to, well, like you say, fail at it. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And then you don't move at all because you're like paralyzed with this fear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's so common, I think.
Yeah, and I see a lot of it in the, well, I saw a lot of it when I was transitioning. People would feel as though they needed to have everything mapped out before they started,
Mm-hmm.
which wasn't what I did. Now, because by the time I really properly started on what anybody else could see as a transition journey, I'd already left, been paid to go away from my company and set up my own. So I was
Mm.
very much in charge of my own sort of timescales, and I know that was a very fortunate position to be in lots of
Mm.
ways. I mean, it's not to say those 3 years were easy, because they weren't. They were really hard financially,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, really tough years. And I'm aware that a lot of people don't have the luxury. They have to sort of have a plan which they work out with their HR departments about what they're going to do when. They can't decide to be gender fluid easily in a workplace.
Mm.
But yeah, so our structures don't make things particularly easy. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's why I got involved in sort of campaigning in the first place. I was explaining to someone back in 2007, 2008 that I'd come off transition pretty lightly, because I'd only lost the relationship with my dad and I'd only lost my job. And I
Wow.
knew people who'd come up, suffered
Mm-hmm.
much worse than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I came away from that conversation, it suddenly dawned on me, either one of those is a huge thing for anyone to deal with.
Absolutely.
And yet I'm saying this is a low cost transition.
Mm.
Why are we expecting trans people to go through those kind of things? Why are we expecting people to pay such an enormous price just to be themselves?
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be easier if we could allow trans people to be themselves without paying that price?
Mm.
And that's what motivated me in the early days, and it still motivates me now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about equality, people being allowed to be who they are and fulfilling their own potential. That's what it's all about.
Wow. I love that. That's so true. Do you have anything else to add that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I think we covered it all really there. Yeah, you've got a
Yeah.
good sense of what drives me and
Absolutely,
how I
yeah.
view the world, I think.
Yeah, I love that. That was a really great conversation. I know it's always just a snippet of, snippet in time and a snippet of a person, but still it's always really juicy. I really like it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, I keep being told I should write a book.
I think you should. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I don't want it to be the when I was 17.
Yeah, it's like finding the right angle for that, isn't it?
Yeah.
That'll come to you, I think, because since things seem to find you. So politics kind of found you, and it's a path you kind of just kind of got on the, like these paths that you have in airports. Like you just kind of step on one, and then it just takes you along, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of like that, I suppose. So, that's what it sounds like political career has been like for you. And I think it's just so important to have people who are just open-minded and understand what certain struggles are like in politics, because a lot of people, they're just making decisions about stuff they have no idea about. They don't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly, I had 2 years on benefits,
Mm.
after starting my company. I remember the fear of which stopped you from going to sleep at night because you just weren't sure whether you could pay the mortgage the next month and keep the roof over your kids' heads and things.
See, that's the thing, and no one should have to deal with that. No. Like universal basic income.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
let's
at the
do that.
beginning of the pandemic, name dropping thing here. I'm very bad at name dropping. Because in 2019 we had a WhatsApp group for all our Lib Dem target candidates, and obviously that included our MPs. We kept that going until about halfway through last year. And when the pandemic hit, I was busy putting messages out. We've got to push a universal income for the pandemic at least, because it takes away people's fears. They know they can pay their bills.
Yeah.
They don't feel then that they have to go to work because if they're ill, because if they don't go to work, they won't get any money. It just removes that whole stress. And I was really pleased I was pushing that right from the beginning. And, a couple of weeks later, I was really pleased when some of our MPs started talking about UBI as a real option. And then even more pleased when I saw it in September coming through as our party policy. It wasn't that I was the key driver for it, because many people have been working on that for a long time. But absolutely. And again, it's about freedom. It's about freeing people to be themselves without feeling that they have to tie themselves to really low paid jobs, insecure jobs, having that underlying feeling of stress all the time. Absolutely agree.
Yeah. It's like they say, isn't it? Like earning a living. It's like we really have to earn a living. We can't just live because we're worthy of that or that we deserve that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It's about how you view humanity, and
totally.
We are not little economic units going through a sausage machine.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Well, thank you so much for talking to me about all this.
Don't know what you're going to do with that, but there you go.
Oh, totally. I think it was great, and I was actually quite pleased to have talked about politics in a positive way, because I'm always like, I can't talk about politics because I don't know anything about politics. But it's like, well, we're all in this system and it all affects us and stuff. So yeah, we can talk about it. I mean, people who don't know much about anything still have opinions about stuff. So we all do in a way. Yeah. So yeah, totally. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Helen, where you can also read the transcript, and you can find Helen on Twitter at Helen C. Belcher. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com and on social media. If you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Plans start from only $1 a month. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender for more details. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded. I thought that was a beautiful place to sort of wrap it up. I'm always really reluctant to say thank you. That's a wrap. So I'm like, is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I think we covered it all really there.